So this video is going to be a little different than what my normal video is. It's a collaboration video. Basically, the TheWiccanRaven and I sat down and talked about one thing that really bugs us about kind of stereotypes of our community. And one of them that we find that's perpetuated a lot by the Christian community is the stereotype that we worship the creation instead of the creator. So this video is going to be about that stereotype, that argument against our belief systems, and why it's wrong, why stereotypes are wrong, and go from there. What I'm hoping that people gain from this is a further understanding of the different pagan paths, and that perhaps maybe they'll think twice about putting out such a stereotypical and kind of ignorant argument.
Hey YouTubers, this is TheWiccanRaven. I'm going to be helping Bluefire Witch today, trying to take out the misconceptions and bad concepts and stereotypes directed towards us as pagans from Christians. I am actually helping Bluefire Witch with this video because when watching Bluefire Witch's videos, you get a good understanding of her side of the issue, her perspective of everything. And she has a great way of attacking issues. She really does. It's just that with a lot of her videos, you only get her side of the story. Granted, she has clips of the opposing opinion, but the only problem is because it's only her perspective as a Hellenist. But it's better to mix two different perspectives, which is why she asked me to help her do a collaboration with this video. So hopefully any Christians that happen to stumble upon this video will find it very informative and very helpful.
The reason I personally think stereotypes are wrong is because there are unfair generalizations about a specific group, whether that group be a cultural group, an ethnic group, a so forth and so on, religious group, whatever. When you make a generalization about a group, even if it's based on a partially true observation, when you generalize that to the entire population of that group without observing the entire population of that group, you have then formed a stereotype. So, for example, Open Air Preacher had made a video recently where he said that witches like to dress in dark clothing and listen to dark music and things like that. And while there may be some witches that do, to stereotype the entire group of witches to do that is wrong, and you can see why, because it's an unfair generalization. There are people out there like myself that don't wear dark clothing and don't necessarily listen to dark music. I like jazz and folk music mainly. And so I don't really get the generalization from his point of view. It comes off as hateful and ignorant, and it isn't a really good dialogue to start with when you're talking about a specific community. And the same thing goes for using the argument that we worship the creation instead of the creator. It's not really, first of all, I don't really know any pagans that do worship creation instead of creator. They may see creation and creator as combined, but the idea that we all have the same worship concept, it basically denies the fact that we have several different religious views under the umbrella term of paganism. And so what they're doing is unfairly generalizing us by what they may have observed by one person, and taking that observation and putting it to everybody.
Stereotypes. Whether they're of a religious group, a working class, an ethnic group, or maybe your everyday high school clique. We've all heard of one or another. We've all probably used them. Any stereotype that has been proven true has become a fact and is no longer a stereotype. A stereotype defined by the dictionary is a simplified and standardized conception or image invested with special meaning and held in common by members of a group. In this case, it would mean that a stereotype is a basic image or concept given to a certain group in society. It generally is created to give a feeling about that group, and usually that feeling is a negative one. Fear, disgust, things of that nature. We've all heard of one. I mean, personally, I have dated and been around Asians before, We all know the Asian stereotypes. For example, all Asians are good in math. I mean, Asians are not always good in math. I mean, a couple of my friends that I had were horrible in math. They had D's, for frickin' sakes. Another one that I've heard of is certain questioning of male body parts. Men are men. They're all going to be different. None of them are going to be the same based on their ethnicity. I'm just going to state that for a fact right now because based on experience I can prove both those stereotypes false. Not that that's surprising. But those are just a couple of stereotypes. I'm sure a lot of you can figure a couple more stereotypes just based on my examples. There's a lot more hurtful or extreme ones out there. I'm sure you guys can remember a couple of them that you probably heard throughout high school and maybe going into society as you were growing up, or probably still hear them if you're still in high school.
There's several reasons why people use stereotypes to categorize or describe a group of people. In the case of this specific stereotype, I think it comes from three different places. The first would be ignorance. They say it because the only information they've gotten about paganism comes from non-pagan sources, and they haven't really talked or asked pagans what it is that they believe, and so therefore they can make this vast generalization, and they've gotten this idea from people who have given it to them. They have passed along that stereotype to people who don't know any better. The second level of that is that they use that stereotype to justify their own belief system, their own point of view. And so what it is it's kind of like it comes from fear. They need to self-justify, and so therefore they want to put other groups in this place of lower stature, that somehow our beliefs are less valid than theirs because we hold a different point of view. A point of view that they have basically strawmanned into this stereotypical argument so that they can win the argument in their own mind. The third place is, a place of, for lack of a better word, hatred. And that is that they want to separate themselves from this group of people to make themselves, better than this group. So it comes from hatred, fear, and ignorance. And none of those things are positive things. None of those things, I think, are things that any deity would respect within their flock. So when you step back from it and you realize what this accomplishes, it accomplishes something that is aspiritual, something that is against any human's description of decent spirituality.
I had stated before that the reason that a stereotype is given is to give a bad image to a certain group, whether it be an ethnic or religious or otherwise. This stereotype is often given to a group, by a group, regardless of if it's religious or otherwise. The reason it's often given is often due to fear or prejudice or discrimination or something of the like. And the reason stereotypes come into being is often just to give a bad image to describe the certain group that it's aimed at. Basically, they prefer to spread this rumor through society, and society will soak it up and digest it, and it'll become a stereotype. And the proof for this is all the stereotypes we have in society today, whether it be a racist name to some ethnic group or a common misconception to a certain religious group. I'm sure we can think of a couple stereotypes aimed at Jews and pagans and Jehovah's Witnesses. I want to tell you guys that the more you guys use them, the more you're actually helping the maker succeed in their goal. Which to some of you probably won't be bothered by this, but to others, you guys should really know that all you're doing is creating a negative influence on a group that really does not deserve it. We're all people. We all have flesh and blood. We're all of the same species. The only thing that's different about us is the colors of our skin and our eyes and our hair. But basically, before you cast a stereotype against somebody else, remember that it's like a rumor from high school, and it's really stupid of you to pass it on. And it's wrong. It's very wrong. People prefer to use stereotypes as an argument, in my opinion, because they refuse to look into a said group and find out for themselves that what they've been told most of their lives is wrong. An example of this, and don't take it personally, an example of this would be, for example, Christians. And the reason I use Christians as an example is because I was one. You don't want to think that your pastor or your parents, who had told you for years that a group of people was wrong and that they were sinners and you should stay away from them. All of a sudden you start to find out that you might have been told wrong and you don't want to believe it. You want to continue to believe that those people are bad and a bad influence and wrong for you to associate with. And that they themselves are wrong. So instead of actually owning up to possibly being wrong, you use a stereotype. Because a stereotype is easier to use than actually doing the research on a certain group that you might be wrong about. It's like throwing a rumor in somebody's face in high school. Not fair and not nice at all. Even within ethnic groups, people prefer to use stereotypes because they refuse to get close to that ethnicity group. And the religious groups, as I said, are no different. They use stereotypes to distance themselves and discredit the individual based on their group that they belong to. Which, as I said before, is not fair and it's not nice. It's very cruel.
Now, I mentioned before that one of the reasons why people use this stereotype is out of ignorance. And I think that when it comes to Christians, many Christians may not realize there's so many different divinity concepts within the pagan culture that we're not just one religion, we are several religions, hundreds of religions in fact. So it's unfair to take this one statement, you worship the creation instead of the creator, and say that that's a valid argument, especially when you understand that there's several different people who see deity differently. And many of those people see deity as separate from nature, which we call panentheistic, where there may be deities directing specific parts of nature. That's my personal belief system. Now, a lot of Christians also see their God as separate from the universe because he created the universe to them, and so therefore he must live outside the universe. So in that aspect, I share something with them because I see that my gods are both outside the universe and within the universe. There's also animism, which is the belief that there is spirit within nature, and that spirit is divine, and that there's also spirit within the universe. It doesn't mean that they worship the creation instead of the creator. In fact, almost all pagan paths will have some sort of creator deity. In addition to animism and panentheism, there is pantheism, which can be kind of combined with some other aspects that I might talk about. But pantheists believe that deity is nature, and that we have personifications for deity that make it easier for us to relate to them, but really deity is nature itself. And so for them, creation and creator are combined. These are combined aspects. So for you to accuse them of worshiping the creation instead of the creator really doesn't make sense to them, because they see them as not separate. They see them as combined aspects.
The pagan and Christian idea of divinity generally differs. Not everywhere, but in most places. Christians are basically, put it, is monotheistic. Their idea of their God is often debated. I have heard different Christians say he's an all-loving, all-forgiving God. I've heard others say he's a wrathful, sin-hating God that will spite you. Others will say that he is a Trinity, and others will say, well, God, Son, and Holy Spirit are different entities entirely. And then there's those that think saints and angels should be prayed to because that message will be sent to God. And then there's those who think God, Mother, and the Son are all different or same entities. Those are generally Gnostic Christians. And then you have certain branches, like, for example, Jehovah's Witnesses, who believe that hell is not in the earth, and it is not a fiery, torturing pit run by Satan. They believe that hell is on earth, and Satan is wandering around pissing people off. The general concept of hell is not usually accepted within paganism, unless you consider Hinduism, excuse me. The idea of Satan, too, is not accepted within paganism, and those that actually do accept the idea of Satan are not pagan and are usually only self-proclaimed pagans. That does not actually make them pagans by definition. Within paganism, there are many, many, many different beliefs, like monotheism, duotheism, polytheism, duotheism. There's a lot of different beliefs there. Even atheistic beliefs are there. Just to name a few. I personally am a polytheist from the Celtic beliefs, as I stated. And I don't hold the Satan or hell beliefs either. I've never have. Even as a Christian, I didn't. I believe that he was basically a lie to make people afraid to leave Christianity. And the idea of Satan is laughable to me. Just the concept and idea of an eternal chamber for bad behavior in one life. Because, I believe in reincarnation also. And many pagans accept the idea of karma. Instead of being punished in the hell, we get punished in our life as we move on. We do something bad, karma punishes us to be cold for it. For example, a friend of mine helped a woman cheat on her husband. A couple of years later, he gets married and his wife cheats on him. That's karma for you. Ideas on the afterlife generally differ in paganism, so I can only speak for myself on my own behalf. I believe in a sort of heaven, but not really. My concept of heaven is generally that when you die, you go to a different plane to cleanse your soul and reflect on your accomplishments and your failures, and to prepare your soul for reincarnation. And while you are in that plane, you can basically visit with friends and family and divinities while you wait.
One of the things about origins of deities, if you look back at the ancient religions, the indigenous religions, you'll find that the earliest conceptions of deity came from nature. For example, in my own religious path, I believe in the Greek gods, and the original Greek gods that formed from the chaos were, Gaia and Uranus, and Gaia is very much the earth goddess. And if you look at the translation of Uranus, it pretty much means sky god. So we've got Mother Earth, Father Sky. Now, even though it's been suggested that the Christian gods' origins were of natural origin, so in other words, he was originally a god of nature, at least that's suggested by many sources. Today's Christians most of the time don't see him that way. They see him as a God separate from nature that created nature and all things, but is separate from nature and the universe, as I said earlier. And so that's one of the biggest differences between our deity concept and theirs, is that ours are usually connected to nature in some way, shape, or form. Even the pantheistic ones that I talked about earlier are still connected to nature, in that they have specific aspects of nature that they rule over. But with the Christian God, he is supposedly all-powerful and does all these things, and nature is just a side note in creation, whereas the focus is on humanity.
Where the concept of God came from, I think everybody knows where I stand on that one, but for those that don't, I've done my research, and basically, from what I've learned, the idea of the Trinity can be found within pagan lore. I mean, Morrigan and Danu and certain goddesses like that were Trinity goddesses, Maiden Mother Crone. And the number 3 was a very very spiritual number in Celtic beliefs. And with the Morrigan, she's a Trinity goddess, and each aspect of herself is given a different name. However, there is the belief she is a separate entity, and all those names are actually her sisters, thus the Morrigan. But for me, that doesn't make sense, so I believe she's a Trinity goddess. The idea of saints didn't come until the Christian missionaries came to Europe and attempted to convert the European pagans. In Ireland, especially, they met a lot of controversy when they tried to do this, especially with the followers of Cernunno. Basically, I guess the Church of Cernunno was very, very adamant in their beliefs. They loved Cernunno so very, very much. They actually even came up with an idea to make Cernunno the sole deity to be worshipped, which was eventually refuted and refused by the people of Ireland. But eventually the Christian missionaries decided to come to a solution and turned a lot of the pagan sabbats from Ireland into Christian holidays like Christmas and Easter. The saints were derived from the gods, and actually, if you actually look in the Bible, a lot of the things from the Bible actually came from paganism, very ancient paganism. For example, frankincense and myrrh. I believe a lot of Christians will remember that those were two of the gifts given to Jesus upon his birth. However, I bet what they don't know is that before the Bible was even written, frankincense and myrrh were two incenses most associated with Yule, along with the burning of the Yule log. A lot of the gods and goddesses that became saints, especially the goddesses, became either warrior goddesses or victims of abuse or rape.
I've expressed in previous videos why I don't believe in a perfect deity, but what I'm going to do this time to make it easier for the Christians who may be watching this video is to put it in terms of Christian philosophers and their idea of perfect deity and why that's not possible or correlated to the Bible. So there's a philosopher that many of you may have heard of. He goes by St. Anselm, or the Archbishop of Canterbury. And St. Anselm was one of the first people to philosophize the idea of perfect deity and why he thought a perfect deity would exist. Now I'm going to paraphrase because, for time constraints, what his argument is, but I'll give you an idea of what it is. Basically, what he said is that if one can conceive of the greatest conceivable being, one of the traits of the greatest conceivable being would be existence. And therefore, if one of the traits of the greatest conceivable being is existence, and we can conceive of the greatest conceivable being, the greatest conceivable being must then exist. Now, people can argue with me about the philosophy of that all they want. That's what it's paraphrased as in my philosophy books. So, I'm not going to go through the entire argument that he wrote because we don't have time for it. But I'm also going to set aside all the arguments against the validity of that argument because people will say, well, wait a second, that doesn't make much sense. It made sense to Anselm, and it made sense to a lot of Christians, and this is the thing that a lot of Christians use when it comes to why their deity exists. I've seen it even today. So what I wanted to do is kind of go through and do a critical analysis of this argument and why it is that this argument could not correlate to the God of the Bible. Now, obviously, when we're dealing with someone's conception of something, we're dealing with their perspective of perfect. It's a subjective perfect, not an objective one. And therefore, if we're dealing with someone's objective notion of perfect, that notion of perfection is going to deviate from other notions of perfection. Now, if all of those notions of perfection include existence, then, for example, you won't just have one greatest conceivable being, you'll have an innumerate number of greatest conceivable beings. And therefore, we don't have a concept of a monotheistic deity, nor do we really have a concrete idea of perfect, being that each person can conceive a different idea of what they believe to be perfect based on their own perceptions, morals, tastes, whatever. What does the perfect God look like? What does the perfect God do? The banker might say that the perfect God makes, the stock market go up. And a farmer thinks the perfect God makes crops grow. So you decide. It's really up to that person's perspective what they think the perfect deity is, and therefore there's going to be an innumerate amount of perfect deities. So the other aspect of this is, of course, that just because one conceives of the greatest being doesn't mean that the characteristics of that greatest conceivable being will line up with the God of the Bible, which is what, of course, these Christian philosophers were trying to prove was the God of the Bible. But their arguments didn't line up with the characteristics of the greatest conceivable being, which, if you look at the Bible, the God of the Bible is contradictory, jealous, murderous, vengeful, and had many other non-perfect traits.
What's wrong with the perfect deity is that, especially since Christians believe that their deity is perfect, we have a saying that in society that no one is perfect, and I believe that this also applies to the Christian God, just by reading the Bible. I mean, in the Bible, it states multiple things that could be considered wrong, just in the Old Testament alone. I'm sure Blue Fire Witch has explained this to you in previous videos, and I'm sure she'd be happy to list it again. For example, the thou shalt not kill, God did state that, and I'm sure all of you remember that. However, despite that being in the Ten Commandments, in the Bible, in total, God kills 371,186 people directly and orders another 1,862,265 people murdered just by his own people. Christianity states that their God is a jealous God, just in the Bible, in Exodus 20, paragraph 5. And since the 3rd century, Christianity has stated that jealousy is one of the 7 deadly sins. So, that being the logic behind all of that would mean that God is sinful, and not exactly as perfect as everybody thinks. That in Genesis chapter 5, it says, make man in our image, which means that there's either more than one God, or it's stating something else, or it's just one of the biggest religious typos ever created. But the problem that I see with a deity being perfect is that there's a lot of problems with being perfect, because the concept of being perfect changes. The idea of perfect in primitive times was probably a lot different than what it is today. We'll say that the Old Testament is no longer in effect. But that's not entirely true, because there's actually some paragraphs that have passed over from the Old Testament to the New. And I know that because I've read both. Secondly, Jesus even stated that the Old Testament is still in effect. And I can actually put in the sidebar where it says that. But the problem with the perfect deity is, like I said, it's very hard to just fill those shoes, because the concept of perfect is, in essence, very hard to fill, because a perfect person doesn't exist. Nobody knows how to be perfect, because nobody can be perfect. To be perfect would mean you'd have to not screw up, ever. People always screw up, and people might argue, well, God's not a person. No, he's not, but he has claimed that we are in his image, and if we're in his image, that means that he's not perfect. We've never been perfect. I mean, if we had been perfect, why would it even be the proof? Imperfection. But that's all just my logic. I'm sure Blue Fire Witch might have an entirely different opinion. But this is my perspective.
So I think that when it comes to the WiccanRaven and myself, the point that we're trying to get across is that the people who make this argument Christians that make this argument don't understand our concept of deity, and they may not even understand their own concept of deity. And it's not that we're trying to stereotype them, because I don't think that all Christians make this argument. But I do find this argument coming from the Christian community. And so this is an attempt to start a dialogue about deity so that we can both understand each other. And hopefully you'll get something from it. Thank you.